like I was waking from a dream I couldn't remember. I didn't understand what was happening at first. I was in a white, sterile room, and there were shadowy figures all around me, slowly morphing from shadows into human shapes. My first thought was that this was another dream, a nightmare, except I didn't feel like I was asleep anymore. My brain was foggy, but through my haze, I realized that the people standing around me wore surgical scrubs and masks. I attempted to lift my head, but nothing happened. I opened my mouth to speak, but there was something in my throat and around my face. I began to panic. My body wanted to thrash wildly, but not a muscle moved. What had happened? Had I been kidnapped and forced to be a subject in some strange experiment? The figures around me were speaking, and I tried to make myself focus, but the terror was growing. The room was full of antiseptic smells and beeping machines. Then the shadowy figure closest to me said, "Scalpel, please." That's when I realized what was happening. I'd been brought in for surgery that morning to correct a congenital heart defect that was causing overcirculation in my body. I'd been terrified about the surgery for months, but it was a medical necessity. One of the last things my mother had said to me before the doctors took me back was, "Sarah, don't worry, you won't feel a thing." But I could feel everything. The cool air in the room, the pressure of the breathing tube in my mouth, the surgeon's hands as she swabbed an area of my chest. Even my eyes weren't under my control. Sometimes it felt like they were blinking rapidly. Sometimes they felt dry and scratchy, like I wasn't blinking at all. I kept trying to move any part of my body. Fingers, toes, nothing worked. The procedure had been explained to me ahead of time. They would give me a paralytic as part of the general anesthesia, so my body wouldn't be able to move reflexively on the operating table, but I'd be unconscious and wouldn't feel anything. But somehow, I had woken up. The paralytic had worked, but the anesthesia hadn't. I watched the surgeon come closer to me with a scalpel. I tried to open my mouth, but it was like every muscle in my body was made of lead. "Stop!" I tried with all my might to tell her. "Stop! I'm awake!" But there was nothing I could do but lie there, completely helpless. I felt a slight pressure on my chest, no pain at first. The blade of the scalpel was so thin, it barely felt like anything. And then I could feel a sharp pain in my chest. I was sure I was dying. I had never felt pain that excruciating in my life. The sides of my chest hurt, and every scream I wanted to let out was silent. Then the surgeon used the other surgical tools. Each one felt different, but they all hurt. The smell of the room was terrible. Actually, I felt more pressure and pain as they began to explore my internal organs. Well, it was less painful once they were touching inside my body, but the pressure, the sensation of my individual organs being moved was terrible. I was sure I was going to throw up. That's when some survival instinct kicked in. You can't throw up, I told myself. If you throw up, you'll choke and you'll die. I concentrated on staying calm. I tried to think about my friends, about school, about anything except what was happening to my body. But the sensation of the surgeon's hands as she touched my heart made it impossible to stay calm. It was like something out of a horror movie. I wanted to scream at them to stop. I wanted to scream for my mother. I wanted to scream and never stop screaming. And then I realized that part of the pressure that I felt in my chest wasn't just the surgeon's hands. It was the breathing tube, which was only giving me one breath every couple of minutes. It felt like there was a giant dog sitting on my open chest. I couldn't get air into my lungs, and I was afraid that even if I could breathe the way I wanted to, breathing would make the excruciating pain even worse. I had to make my body move. I had to find a way around the paralytic to let the doctors know that I was awake and feeling everything. I concentrated as hard as I could, but each time I felt close to moving, the surgeon's hands would shift inside me and a new wave of panic and pain would hit me. Finally, I managed to twitch my hand. At least I thought I did. At that point, I couldn't tell if I was just imagining it or not. Then I felt a hand on mine, and I almost passed out with relief. It was the assistant, and if she'd seen my hand move, then maybe she'd realize what was happening. The breathing tube gave me another breath. I drank that air gratefully, hoping my ordeal was about to be over. Then I realized that the assistant was holding my hand in place, not reassuring or helping me. I heard her say to the surgeon, "This one's a little jumpy," and they both laughed. I had never felt such overwhelming despair and terror in my whole life. I was going to die here, and I was going to die in terrible pain. I didn't realize it was about to get worse. One of my eyelids was forced down and taped in place. Half of my world went black, then the other half. Now I couldn't see the surgeons, couldn't tell when they were about to touch me or cut me. The machines around me started beeping and I felt a terrible chill, like someone had dumped ice into my open chest. My body began to shiver, but I didn't know if the muscles were really working or if I was just imagining it. My lungs were slowly being crushed by lack of air, and I couldn't feel anything but fear. I silently said my last goodbyes to my friends and family. Then, something strange happened. It was like I left my body and floated up to the ceiling. My eyes were open again, and I could see myself down there on the table. Could see my open chest and the mess of organs inside me. The tape over my eyelids, that horrible breathing tube down my throat. I could see the surgeon and her assistant still joking with each other. Had I died? Was I on my way to the afterlife? I didn't feel scared anymore, and luckily I couldn't feel pain. But what hit me now was a flood of memories, like when people say your life flashes before your eyes as you're about to die. The first face I saw was my mom's. I remembered those awful few months leading up to the surgery. I had been so scared that the surgery wouldn't work, that I would die on the table or afterward from a heart complication. My anxiety had me terrible to be around. I was mean to everyone. I never did what was expected of me at school or at home, and nobody even tried to make me because they knew I was sick. My mom was the only person who pushed me, who made me do my homework and study for college admissions tests and do my chores, as though she truly believed I was going to have a long, full life. But there was no guarantee, and because of that fear, I took all of my anger out on her. By the time the day of the surgery rolled around, we were barely speaking to each other. But in the waiting room, when I'd been shaking with terror, she had looked at me and told me everything would be all right, that I wouldn't feel a thing, that she would see me on the other side. I'd wanted to tell her that I loved her, but I was too afraid and angry, irrationally angry, as though she was the one who was making me do this. The nurse had taken me back to the operating room before I could get the words out. Remembering that now, I knew that I had to live. I had to live so that I could tell her I loved her and that I was sorry. I looked down at my body lying on that table and I concentrated with all my might. Move your hand, I told myself. You have to move your hand. It wasn't working. I saw the body on the table as though from a great distance. I could sort of remember what it felt like to struggle to breathe, to feel the scalpel ripping into my body, but all of that was slowly fading. It would be so easy to just keep floating. Then my hand twitched. Once, twice, 3 times. The machine started beeping again. Suddenly, I slammed back into my body on the table. The pain was back, the struggle to breathe, but I didn't care anymore. All that mattered was living through this. An assistant was removing my breathing tube. The beeping of the machines was a cacophony that hurt my head. I could hear people saying, "She's awake and we have to get her back under." They had figured it out. Someone was talking to me, saying my name, telling me to try to stay calm, that I would sleep in a moment. I was still terrified. What if the anesthesia didn't work again? Or what if I did go back to sleep, but I never woke up? Blackness edged my vision again, but this time I let it take me. When I woke up again, everything was fuzzy. It took me a moment to realize where I was, and when I did, I panicked, thrashing on the bed, afraid that I was still being cut into. A nurse came and calmed me down, and then a surgeon came in. I was awake, I told her. I felt everything. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said how sorry she was that this happened to me. She said it was very, very rare and that I was one of the unlucky ones. I didn't know what else to say. In some ways, I did feel like one of the unlucky ones, but at the same time, I was incredibly lucky to have survived. Tears welled in my eyes, then started sliding down my cheeks. I felt so confused and afraid until a face appeared in the doorway. The one face that I desperately wanted to see. My mom. She hurried to my bedside and asked me what had happened. I just held onto her and told her that I loved her and was sorry for all the times that I'd hurt her. She said it was okay, that none of that mattered, that she loved me so much. Then I took a deep breath and started to tell her what I experienced. The recovery from the surgery was long, but I'm doing okay now. I still have PTSD from my ordeal. Some nights I wake up in a panic, thinking I can't move, that I'm back on the operating table with a scalpel about to slice me open. Sometimes my body won't move or my voice won't work, even though I'm not under the influence of a paralytic. It's like the memories are so strong, they can freeze up my body again. But my mom has been wonderful through it all, helping me through it. I realize now how grateful I should have been for her all along. After all, it was her strength that gave me the strength to survive.
Hi, my name is Gloria, and recently I went through something pretty traumatic. Unlike most of you, I never found a place that I can call home. You see, I'm originally from Mexico, but last year I immigrated to the USA. Throughout my childhood, everyone always talked about the American dream. So when my dad told us we'd be moving there, I wasn't surprised. But what happened next turned my family's life upside down. I still get shivers thinking about it today, and I need to be honest with you guys. I wish we'd never moved. Truly, it was the biggest mistake of our life. Part of me was a tiny bit curious about moving to the USA, but I didn't want to leave Mexico. Our life was simple, and I liked it that way. My dad, however, always talked about the lack of opportunities for us in Mexico and how we could have a much better life if we immigrated. His best friend Juan moved a few years ago, and he made out as if living in the USA was the best thing ever. For Juan and his family, it had been such a smooth process. They had obtained their visas easily, found a nice enough apartment, and landed good jobs and places in a great school. It seems so simple, right? And he promised my dad it'd be the same for us. That once we got there, we'd live happily ever after like them. Well, if only. Dad decided he would go first and stay with Juan until he sorted things out for us. His visa was surprisingly quick to come through, and before we knew it, he was on his way. We dropped him off at the border with only a suitcase of clothes and said we'd see him soon. Mom was pretty emotional, as this would be the first time they'd been separated since they'd met. There were a lot of tears, and I remember thinking, chill out, Mom. I mean, we'd be there in like a month. Why all the tears? It's almost like she had a premonition of what was going to happen. Later that day, we got a call from Dad, and everything had gone well. He was at Juan's place, and he said he'd start looking for a job immediately, and that we should begin the visa process. He urged us to use the agency he'd used, as they had a few guys on the inside that could hustle the visas along. So that's what we did. We used an agency, and they promised us the visas would be ready within a month. After a month passed, we still didn't have our visas. We were worried something had gone wrong. I felt this deep sense of dread, but also a kind of peace. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. During our month of waiting, Dad landed 2 jobs. One was stacking shelves with Juan in a supermarket, and the other was as a taxi driver. So he was pretty much working 24/7. I mean, would we even see him? We eventually got our visas. Turns out they'd messed up our names and had to redo them all. We headed towards the border, and it was like deja vu, except this time, we were the ones crossing. I crossed first and had no problems. They asked me a few questions like where would I be living, what school would I be going to, etc. But otherwise, it was super chilled, and I felt so relieved. I mean, you always hear these horror stories of immigration officials interrogating people. Pedro was up next, and it was smooth sailing for him too. They didn't ask him any questions because his English is pretty much non-existent. He was only 7 years old then, so you can't blame him. Then it was Mom's turn. It looked like everything was going well. It almost looked like the immigration official was flirting with Mom. I saw her laughing, but then something else happened. Suddenly, she wasn't laughing. She wasn't even smiling. 2 security guards came over and one was on the phone. The next moment was a complete blur as I saw Mom break down into tears and get escorted away. I started screaming for her. She tried to turn around, but the guards were marching her towards the interrogation room. I could hear her wailing, and I honestly had no idea what to do. I tried to get back through immigration to the Mexican side, but we were stuck in no man's land. They wouldn't let us through. I was shouting my mom's name until I almost lost my voice. An hour passed, and Pedro and I were inconsolable. We knew our dad was waiting just on the other side, and he'd be worried about us. Eventually, a female immigration officer came over to us and told us something that was about to change our lives forever. Sorry, kids, but your mom won't be getting into the USA anytime soon, I'm afraid. She committed a bad crime a few years back, and so whoever issued her visa did it illegally. There's a huge black mark on her name. Sorry to break the news to you like this, but let's get you onto the other side, shall we? I hear your dad is waiting for you. As she said all of this, tears started streaming down my face. I thought I would throw up. How could my mom be a criminal? Surely it was some kind of mistake. My mom is a nurse. She wouldn't hurt a fly. I told the woman we weren't going anywhere, but she looked me directly in the eyes and told me we didn't have a choice. And then she said something that made me want to hurt her. I advise you to cooperate here, girl. You don't want to turn out like your mom, do you? Anger was pulsing through me, and suddenly all I wanted was to see my dad. Did he know about what Mom had done? What had she done? We made it through to the American side, and if I never had to see those immigration officials again in my life, I'd be forever grateful. Both Pedro and I ran into Dad's arms, and he could instantly tell something had happened. "Where's your mom?" he said. I couldn't even speak, and he knew. His face crumbled. I'd never seen him look so broken as he did at that moment. The taxi ride back to our new life was miserable. None of us spoke. You could have pierced the silence with a needle. It was honestly horrible. Our life as we'd known it was over. That first day, I didn't even notice how run down our neighborhood was, or the fact that all we had was one mattress on the floor to sleep on. It's not like we could sleep anyway. Juan and his wife rushed over and tried to put us in touch with some lawyers, but it seemed hopeless. It all felt too raw for me to even ask Dad what Mom had done. But in bed that night, he finally told me. Before we were born, Mom had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. She had been working a night shift at the hospital and had hit a young guy who was walking in the road. She hadn't noticed and had continued on home. But then she noticed a bit of blood on her car and suddenly realized what had happened. They'd thought this was all in the past and that it would have been wiped off her record by now because the young guy had survived and had eventually dropped the charges. But clearly, this was still haunting them. At first, I felt angry. Why hadn't my mom stopped to help? That seemed so unlike her. But then things started to make sense, like why she was so jittery and nervous when we were driving on certain roads. I felt so bad for her. An accident that was actually a crime was now creeping back up and destroying her life, and our lives too? Life just felt so unfair. What would we do? Dad said she'd never get through the border now. There was no way. That night, we all cried ourselves to sleep and hoped the morning would bring some good news. But it didn't. Things just got worse. In the daylight, I noticed how dirty our new place was, and how noisy. I told Dad we should just go home and be with Mom. She needed us. But he refused. He said we'd find a way to get her here, and in the meantime, we had to start school and make a new life for ourselves. Easier said than done, though. I'm not lying when I say the next year flew by. It flew by in a blur of lawyer appointments, homework, and slowly trying to rebuild our life without Mom. Mom, of course, was back in the village with all our family and back in her old job, but she was heartbroken. We all were. I barely made any friends that first year. I just focused on getting good grades so that this whole immigration move wouldn't have been for nothing. Pedro adapted pretty quickly, and soon his English was almost as good as mine. Dad worked really hard all year so that he could rent us a nicer house to live in. Something with a small garden. And when we eventually did move into that house, things did get better. I think I grew used to being the motherly figure in the house, and we were still so determined to get Mom into the USA. Dad was working tirelessly with a lawyer, but so far they hadn't been successful. Honestly, some days I wanted to just give up driving off with his taxi. They'd robbed us. We called the police, but there was nothing they could do. It felt like for every one step forward, we took two backward. Dad was devastated. At that moment, I realized this wasn't working. We were just living in this huge bubble of uncertainty and pretending that everything was okay. All we wanted more than anything was to be reunited with Mom, and the only way to make this happen was to move home. After everything my dad had done to make this work, we realized it was hopeless. And now that he'd just had his taxi stolen, we took this as a sign that it was time to go home. And you know what? I don't regret it for a second. I mean, we tried. We really did. But living without Mom just isn't a life we want to live. Now we're back in Mexico, and our American dream seems like a distant nightmare. What do you think of my story? Please leave your comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.